a prestigious scholarship to Dumbarton Oaks Research Library, where I started working on my second book titled Islamic Maritime Laws in the Mediterranean. It's a comparative study between Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic commercial maritime laws. I got my second book accepted for publication by Brill, and in 2011, I was thinking what to do, and I just said, in 2005, I went to study maritime law in Tulane Law School with a specialty on modern maritime law. There, I completed my second book that I started in 2001, and during my study as a graduate student in the undergraduate program, I got more exposed to law of the sea. And I took one class, and it was really a very good class. I enjoyed it very much. I must admit that the class wasn't that, the professor wasn't, like in like my classes as well. I have also dry classes, but the subject was quite interesting. When I went on sabbatical in 2011, I decided to write my book after I acquired a great deal of knowledge on this subject, to write a book in response to Hugo Grotius, in response to his 1609 Mari Liberum. And it's quite interesting because the subject hasn't been studied by before by any Muslim scholars. I'm not looking for, God forbid, I'm not looking for fame. It's as we say in Islamic tradition, three things a person leaves behind, after his death: sadaqah, sadaqah, alms giving; ilmun yantafi'u bihi an-nas, knowledge that benefits people; and waladun salih yad'u lahu, means that you have a son or a daughter that practices who practices them and call for him for good things, whatever the case. So I was simply motivated, honestly speaking, by two elements: religious element factor and academic factor. I want to expose what Muslims had contributed at the time when other culture ignore or overlook the Islamic contribution to the development of international law of the sea. So I look definitely, in order to respond to Grotius' theory, I had to read his book, his chapter in his book. This was a chapter in a book, and to read the other articles on this particular subject. I ended up doing some East Asian studies, Southeast Asian studies, and it was really different world. It's different from the Mediterranean, because we live in the Mediterranean it's Middle Sea with lots of conflicts, beginning with the 7th century, with the Islamic emergence and rise in the Mediterranean. Because at the time when the Muslims expanded militarily in the Mediterranean was simply a Roman lake. And this is very, very interesting, very intriguing, an intriguing question, in a sense that all European scholars, when they refer to international law of the sea, they refer back to the Roman law. Roman law is not international law. Although we have used gentio or nolius, and you use nolius, and you have also res communis. Actually, these are domestic laws, but at that time, the Roman Empire controlled the whole Mediterranean. These laws applied only to the Mediterranean. Anyway, so this is how I came to my subjects. I decided to focus on three topics. I could have added the so-called environmental law, and I could touch on pollution, marine pollution. I have found references from classical Islamic sources on marine pollution, but I decided just for the time being to focus only on three major topics. The introduction, definitely, I will refer in a minute to the introduction. The first chapter I titled Freedom of the Seas. This is a very interesting issue. The second one deals with the territorial sea as reflected in Islamic primary sources. And the last and most interesting issue, people find more lively than the other three topics, the other above two topics, is piracy and its legal implication. How Islam looks at piracy. Anyway, so I left the marine pollution probably for future study. But these are the most important issues that are dealt with in the UNCLOS. And I asked myself, is the UNCLOS different from the Islamic concept or Islamic conception of the law of the sea? When you have a strong background on, in modern law of the sea, it's very easy. It's much easier to return back to the earlier periods. Like every other thesis, you have to lay down the most important issues in the introduction. I did with the human rights and customary law of the sea. I'm not going to talk about every particular issue, and it's quite difficult to present all the issues I addressed in my book, but I will touch in very particular issues in due course. The general background is how pre-Islamic societies and cultures and states and empires looked at the sea. I began my research from the biblical period until the Roman and even the Byzantine period, and even my introduction I touch on medieval Italian city-states, how they viewed the sea and how they viewed the maritime zones adjacent to their maritime frontiers. Then I went to discuss on the custom as a source of law, as a source of Islamic law. Definitely, what's interesting in this particular subject, that with the expansion of Islam in the East and the West, in the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, we have one central regime, one central government, with two different administrative systems. It's amazing that the Muslim governments or Muslim caliphates maintained the two systems, the Byzantine in the West and the Persian in the East. And this is the way how Islam expanded. They never create or established a new system. Simply the Islamization of the administrative system took some years, but the whole people remained in situ. They never, very little, a very small percentage of the Persians and the Byzantines who left their territories after the Islamic expansion in the former Byzantine and Persian empires. So the custom was part of Islamic law of the sea, and in this case, definitely I return back to the sources of Islamic law. I return back to the Quran, the cardinal element. Then I go back to the Sunnah, especially written Sunnah, and I emphasize written Sunnah. Then and I explain how I'm going to address the subjects of each chapter. Okay, the purpose. it aims primarily to achieve an understanding of the theoretical and practical concepts of the Islamic customary law of the sea. Why I call it customary law of the sea? Because although the Quran is the main source of Islamic law, only less than 500 statutory law mention the Quran. The Quran, we call it in Arabic, haya. I mean, the Quran is a way of living. Is partially, the law is covered in the Quran, but the whole thing, the whole Quran is a way of living. So, with reference to the law of the sea, the Quran presents what the divine law, what Allah thinks, how we deal with the open sea, with the sea in general, but doesn't obligate Muslims, or doesn't lay obligation in this regard. So it aims primarily to achieve understanding of the theoretical and practical concepts of the customary law of the sea that are absent not only from the writings of influential Dutch humanists. I refer here to Grotius, but also from pre-modern and contemporary Western legal literature. This is the main purpose of my research. Okay, this is a decent research. I'm not saying that this is the deepest and the most comprehensive, but this is as a beginning is really a decent research. So I started with the first chapter. I started this. The questions I address in the first chapters are quite clear. How the Quran views the legal status of the sea. Listen, guys. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. The Quran, to the best of my knowledge, the sea is mentioned 32 times in the Quran, and the land is mentioned 13 times in the Quran. If we divide 32 by 45, which is the number, times the land, the number of mentioning the land in the Quran plus the number of mentioning the sea in the Quran, we get the same percentage, with the same ratio between land and sea on the globus. So the sea is mentioned almost 3 times more than the land in the Quran. So the sea plays a cardinal issue in our tradition. If I look at the Muslim world nowadays, the main concentration of Muslim population is living in the sea, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Southeast Asia. The main concentration. If I look, for example, at India, the concentration of Muslim population is along the coast of India, Bangladesh, whatever, all the countries. The great majority of Muslim population is living along the coast and in the archipelagos. Okay, so the sea plays an essential part, and as a cardinal element in our tradition. Now, this is the second question, deals with the expansion of the European powers in the Mediterranean as well as in the Indian Ocean. Did naval supremacy and military expansion empower or entitle state to claim dominion over the sea? Okay, that's exactly what we see nowadays. For example, if you look at the United States, it doesn't have this country. This superpower country doesn't have commercial fleets, because it's very expensive to hold commercial, or to maintain or hold commercial fleets in the country because of the taxes and whatever, and inspections, and there are lots of associated things related to the status of commercial fleets in the US. However, this is the most powerful nation, on earth, because it controls the seas. Ibn Khaldun said that the 14th, 15th century Muslim philosopher Ibn Khaldun has a beautiful saying: who controls the sea controls the world. Okay, then I move to the third question: how did Prophet Muhammad view the sea? And when you look, it's a beautiful issue. This is a prophet who never experienced the sea, never experienced the sea. However, we must keep in mind that the first migration of Muslims was in the sea. When Muslims migrated from Mecca, they left from Mecca to Jeddah, from Jeddah to Ethiopia. The first migration, the first Islamic migration, took place in the sea. But this, our noble prophet, I didn't find a reference which tells us that Prophet Muhammad experienced traveling by sea. So, but nonetheless, his contribution, he laid the foundations for the future customary Islamic law of the sea. He laid the foundations through the 630 treaties, safe of conduct between the Muslims and the patriarch of the port city of Aqaba today. Ayala, we called it Aqaba. Then I moved to the other issues. Under Islamic law, did the ship or vessels enjoy legal immunity while at sea, in ports, or on navigable rivers? So when you have foreign ships, can I attack every ship? Can I attack foreign ships while on the high seas, or in the Euphrates, or in Nile, or within the territorial sea? When we talk about the freedom of navigation, this is really a cardinal issue. The fifth question for the first chapter: what legal measures were employed to protect aliens in the abode of Islam at sea? Okay, yes, and Muslim subjects and foreign territories. How Muslim subjects were protected while at sea or in foreign territories, and how aliens were protected while at sea and in Islamic territories from enemies of both countries. Why does the Sharia favor legal pluralism? And then I talked about legal pluralism, and why the Islamic law why Islamic Sharia doesn't impose a unified law on its territory, both Muslims and Dhimmis, Christians and Jews. Okay, so why Islam maintained the laws, or the legal autonomy for those living within the abode of Islam. And the last question: how did legal pluralism have significant impact on the exercise of the right of freedom of the seas, ultimately promoting commercial activities? Okay, in order to answer these questions, I divided the chapter into the following topics and subtopics. Okay, the tradition, the pre-Islamic tradition on the law of the sea, or customary law of the sea. I emphasize the issue of customary law of the sea because we didn't have the United Nations that time, and it was a common custom that the sea is not subject to sort of proprietorship of one country or another. Then I moved to talk about the law of nature. Definitely, when I talk about the law of nature, I refer back to earlier customs, earlier traditions, earlier law, especially Roman law. Again, we have to remember Roman law applies to Roman territory, including the Mediterranean, because the whole Mediterranean was a Roman lake. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Okay, the division of the Mediterranean began, as I mentioned later on, with the expansion of Islam in the Mediterranean. That was military expansion. And then I moved to talk about the commonality of the sea under Islamic law of nations. When I talk about Islamic law of nations, I refer back to the seer books, to the book of, to the seer. Seer means international law. Seer could mean also biography. But when we say seer, we refer back to the seer books, including the seer of Al-Awza'i, Abu Hanifa, sorry, مش Abu Hanifa. No, not Abu Hanifa. Shaybani, yeah, and the Sarakhsi and others. Okay, there are references there. You simply, when you deal with seer, you look sometimes for specific idioms or specific terms with reference to the law of the sea. And the seer book name basically put focus on the safe conduct. We call it in Arabic aman. Then I went on to discuss the Prophet Muhammad's doctrine on the free sea. Here, I went back to the treaties our Prophet Muhammad concluded with the Christians of Najran, Christians of Palestine, Christians of Armenia, and the Christians, and most important, the 630s safe conduct with the patriarch of the port city of Ayala, which is today called Aqab. Then, when I laid the foundation of my research, of my chapter, depending solely on Sunnah and the Quran, the first place, and Sunnah in the second place, I went on to discuss what happened after that. What happened after that? During the Umayyad, we have little bit from the Umayyad, but we have more from the Abbasid and later periods. I discussed the issue of safe conduct, how Muslim authorities viewed the legal status of non-Muslims on the high seas and within the abode of Islam. Okay, this is the first element of written documents. Then I moved on to talk about the diplomatic and commercial treaties. In this regard, I relied heavily on references from the Mediterranean. I didn't find, probably because of linguistic obstacles or whatever, but I couldn't find references on commercial, I couldn't find references on international treaties in the Indian Ocean. I couldn't find, probably because the Indian Ocean, especially the western part of the Indian Ocean, was regarded a Muslim lake. Lake. We don't compare the lake of the Indian Ocean, the western part of the ocean, with the lake with the Roman lake in the Mediterranean. So I moved on to discuss when the principles of international law of the sea were laid down. When you have a contested region, contested countries, contested territories, you have always agreements. When you have a peaceful atmosphere, you don't have treaties. So all the treaties that deal with maritime law, with the law of the sea, not maritime law, with the law of the sea and the freedom of navigation, I found only in the Mediterranean region. in the Mediterranean arena. Okay, we don't have such a thing in the Indian Ocean. So I call the contested sea, and to the I would say my conclusion is that the law of the sea, the foundations of the law of the sea were laid in the Mediterranean region, in the Mediterranean world, with the rise of Islam from the beginning of the 7th century onwards. This is my conclusion. As regards to the eastern seas, the Indian Ocean, which was divided between three different cultures, the Arabs and the Persians in the west, the Indian in the middle, and the Chinese and Southeast Asians in the east. We don't have treaties. I looked carefully. Then I went back to look at the Maritime Code of Malacca. There are references on pertaining to the freedom of navigation, but we don't have treaties between countries. Then I moved, the concluding topic of my first chapter deals with the status of warships and non-combatant immunity on high seas. When Muslims were allowed to attack warships, okay? Because if you attack a warship, you simply create, you lay the foundation, you lay the grounds for unfavorable war, or for you should simply create enmity between the two countries. Chapter 2. Okay, this is really interesting. I said, okay, this is the first chapter. I concluded with the status of warships on the high seas. Chapter 2 is dedicated to coastal, what's called adjacent waters or territorial sea. What were the circumstances in which a coastal state could claim jurisdiction over waters adjoining its shores? Was that claim exclusive? Did the coastal self-ruling independent entity have a right to deny access or bar foreign ships from sailing through its territorial sea? If the ship was exposed to man-made or natural dangers, was she granted permission to seek refuge? Okay, dealing with coastal navigation or what with coasting, these are the most important issues I addressed in my chapter. Okay. It's very interesting. When you deal with the territorial sea, you must have some conclusive evidence showing that Muslim jurists and scholars recognized the offshore zone as part of their countries. I looked at the Kitab al by Shafi'i, and I couldn't find more decisive statement written by Shafi'i regarding the legal status of offshore zone of the Hijaz. In his Kitab al look, I'm looking here for I'm looking here for one statement, guys. One statement in the 4th chapter of Kitab al probably either page 187 or 188. He refers there to the territorial sea of the Hijaz. I'm going to read the text in Arabic, then I will move to read the text. My translation, my English translation. وإذا كان هكذا, he refers here to dhimmis, Are they allowed to travel by? Are they allowed to cross the territorial sea of Hijaz or not? Are they allowed? Are they allowed to live in Hijaz? Are they allowed to live in the islands? How many days, how many nights they are allowed to stay within, in one place for how many, in one particular place? Because when you cross the Hijaz, the Sea of Hijaz, it's a long sea. It's almost more than 1,000 kilometers. However, to cross the 1,000 kilometers will take sometimes a week or so. But were they allowed to stay on the islands, or to enter the Hijaz itself on the land? So الشافعي said وإذا كان هكذا فلا يتبين أن يمنع ركوب بحر الحجاز ويمنعون المقام في سواحله، وكذلك إن كانت في بحر الحجاز جزائر وجبال تسكن منعوا سكناها لأنها من أرض الحجاز. If that were the case, they shall evidently not be prevented from sailing in the Sea of Hijaz. They shall, however, be prevented from taking up permanent residence on its coasts. Equally, then, in addition to the coast, he adds, equally, if there are islands and mountains in the Sea of Hijaz that can sustain human habitation, the means shall be prevented from taking up permanent residence on them, because all of them are part of the Hijazi territory. How many nights they are allowed to stay in one particular territory of Hijaz? They can stay only for 3 nights, 4 days, but they are not entitled. They are not entitled to live or to stay for more than 4 days. The other question one may ask: are the Mees allowed to take advantage, like fishing for personal consuming? And the answer is definitely yes, they are allowed. Anyway, this is my starting point when I dealt with the Sea of Hijaz. With the Sea of Hijaz. Okay, so I return back, and now I definitely, when we discuss the issue of offshore sovereignty and territorial sea, I always compare the Islamic tradition with other traditions, with the pre-Roman to the late medieval European traditions. I definitely refer here to the status of the territorial sea as established in the Venetian culture, the Venetian concept of the territorial sea. Then I move to address the Islamic concept of territorial sea. I refer definitely, as I mentioned earlier, to the religious premises of offshore proprietorship, the Sea of Hijaz as an example. Okay, then I move to the Harim zone. And territorial sea here, what I'll call Harim zone. I discuss issues pertaining to coastal settlements, whether non-residents are allowed, for example, to move and fish in other sovereignties, maritime zones, and the soil, and other things. Then I move to talk about military and security justifications. I talk about the coastal fortifications and its role in coastal navigation, and definitely when we talk about security, and we talk, for example, about Palestine. Palestine was a frontier. It was always exposed it was exposed to maritime attacks of the Byzantines, of the Christians, in attempts to probably to emancipate or liberate the whole places, the Christian whole places from Christians, from Muslim authority. Then I talked about the right of passage under international treaties. Here again, I discuss the major treaties concluded between Muslim and Christian powers in the Mediterranean. I don't have any reference to the Indian Ocean. I couldn't find anything referring to the Indian Ocean. So all the treaties I dealt with dated from the late 11th century until the early Ottoman period. One subject, which is really interesting, is Strait Passage. Do Muslim authorities impose or levy, levy on commercial ships, taxes or whatever to get access in the through the straits? And I compared the straits of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and with the Byzantine Empire. Sorry, with the Byzantine Empire, yes. And nowadays, by the way, Strait Passage was always free, except for the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus merchants from the Roman period to the present day continue to pay money for the passage. Now and then, personality, territoriality, and extraterritoriality, the status of Muslims on the high seas based on treaties and customs, gender status of dhimmis, Jews and Christians, and the role of the consuls in Islamic port cities in the Mediterranean. This is essentially the second chapter. Then the last chapter is on piracy. Unfortunately, nowadays, when someone talks about jihad, the media or the modern media associates jihad with terror, and this is really wrong. That time, even when I look at maritime jihad in the medieval Mediterranean, and always Western scholars compare jihad as we view jihad as piracy. It's not the case. The Quran the Quran, I would say, hence doesn't give an illustration how we view piracy. But in Surah Al-Ma'idah, I think chapter 5 in the Quran, verse 32, 33, 34, talks about the people who spread corruption on the seas and on land. And when we talk about corruption on the seas, we always refer to people who people or groups who hinder the freedom of navigation on the high seas and the adjacent waters. So in this chapter, I focus on how Islam views piracy, and what's more important, what's more meritorious, fighting piracy or launching jihad against the enemies. And the Quran jurisprudential sources clearly state that fighting piracy is more meritorious than launching jihad against enemy countries. The subjects I addressed there as the definite definition, the relationship between jihad and piracy. What are the reasons, that factors fostering piracy in the world? What are the means or methods employed to fight piracy, actually, the methods employed during that time do not differ from our days. People pay vigilance when you travel in pirate and infested area. You always have all the crew ready to protect the ship, or you pay bribery. They pay the bribery. Insurance company pay bribery in order to protect ships in different parts in certain places, around the world. Armed forces use armed forces or naval escort, coastal surveillance, okay, and international collaboration through treaties. And the last thing is military subjugation. When I look at the punishment of piracy, what's written in Islamic sources simply is compatible with what was implemented by France and Britain with their pirates: crucifixion, or sending them overseas sending them to their overseas colonial territories. What's written in Islamic sources simply was in fact in practice in Western culture. Okay, conclusion. This is my conclusion. All humans are by divine law the children of Adam. Members of all races and religions should enjoy equal rights of access to the sea. The Quran views Muslims as a nation. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت الناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. You are the best of nations, calling for good things, calling for good deeds and preventing bad deeds. Islamic customary law of the sea derived from the Prophet Muhammad's sunnahs, written sunnah here, I refer to written sunnah, and most directly to the 9th AH after the Hijrah, or 630 pledge of security. Security and economic considerations could dictate that states exercise some degree of sovereign jurisdiction over limited offshore maritime zones, including bays, gulf, indentations, islands, and islets. The Quran, exegetical literature, and jurisprudential sources eliminate ambiguities between jihad and piracy. Last but not least, the rise of international law began with the rise of Islam in the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean until the emergence of the Portuguese and other European powers was a peaceful sea, a peaceful zone, a peaceful maritime zone, and divided between three different cultures, and none of them claimed sovereignty over the vast ocean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's very fascinating research. I've been making a lot of notes and I have a lot of questions. But I see that this is mostly in relation to the Mediterranean waters, yeah. And you mentioned about the number of straits that are still very important today here. And I believe this is a very important aspect as well in terms of the understanding of how law of the sea is developed. Now, before I ask other colleague from Indonesia to have some comments or questions, probably I will kick off with one question to you, Professor. In your research, in your findings, do you see there is a movement of what do you call it? There is a movement of knowledge, an understanding of how sea is being managed from Mediterranean Mediterranean time, and then it goes to the European time, and then finally it goes to people in Europe. The reason I ask you a question is that people like Hugo the Groot, when they come up with the theory, of course they don't just suddenly come up with a theory. They probably read something, you know. They probably consult with the previous documents. They consult with the previous articles. It's just impossible for lawyers, especially, to suddenly come up with idea without actually having to read different references. So, do you see that there's a possibility that these European lawyers, in the early days, they have read also some thinking, some legal approach from Islamic world in the Mediterranean going to Europe, Professor?
Yes, that's true. If you look at the Grotius book, who refers to the Muslims as infidels, and he said that before the rise of the European powers in the Indian Oceans, there was a customary law in that region, and people used to, to trade freely between one territory to another. Now, and if you look at the word infidels, it was mentioned more than 10 times in his book, in his Mari Libir. As for the Mediterranean, it's interesting. The Mediterranean, when you publish, a scholarly work, you must rely on written evidence. You can't say, okay, this is my own interpretation. You have to rely on documentary evidence. And in the in the Mediterranean world, there was the Roman influence, which was transformed to the rising Islamic culture in the Mediterranean. Muslim jurists not only took these laws or these practices or these customary laws, but they developed them further. Now, if you look at the treaties between between the Mamluks and European powers, or between Almohads in the 12th century and European powers, or even later, they are written in the same structure. Okay. Now, what you notice there, you see that when the Christian powers are supreme, or when the Muslims are supreme, you look at the chapters and you find out that the consuls within the abode of Islam were influenced by the customary maritime laws of Muslims within their own abode. That's to say that, let me put it this way, where these customary laws transformed to European countries, the answer is yes. Where are noticeable? In Spain and the city-states of Italy. How can we see the influence? Either using almost same terminology. Even sometimes Arabic words can be found in these treaties, Arabic words that were Latinized, or through comparing local treaties between Christian powers and the same power with Muslim powers or with Muslim sovereignty. So you can see how the law was transformed from Islam, from the abode of Islam to the abode of war, or to Christian world. One issue here I would like to address. If you deal with maritime law, I came across a Ghanesa document from 1033 about the personification of the ship. The ship as a personal entity. And this is very, very interesting. I mean, when you look at the common law system, what characterizes the common law with the civil law system is two elements, two features: limited liability and limited liability of the ship, of the ship owner, sorry, and personification of the ship, in rem actio. Now, personification of the ship, I came across this document from the Ghanesa from 1033. Regarding that limited liability, it's already mentioned in the Kitab Akiyat al-Safon by Muhammad ibn Umar from the 10th century. So these two elements are an Islamic establishment. They aren't found neither in Roman nor in Byzantine laws, or nor in medieval Italian city-state laws. This is, this is an example how the law transformed from the abode of Islam to the European communities, sorry, to the European nations or states. Hopefully I answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Actually, there is a similar question here from the chat room from Ankit Malhotra. Ankit asked the question, what is the impact of Islam in the creation of law of the sea, which is essentially a product of European capitalism and colonization? So this is what Ankit is saying. I think you already mentioned before very clearly that there is a movement, or there is an impact, or there is a contributions from Islamic legal approach, or Islamic legal system, if you will, in the law of the sea into the current law of the sea. But maybe I also would like to add to Ankit that law of the sea, I think you have to divide it between before 58 and after 58. After 58, the creation of law of the sea actually takes into account the voices of developing countries, not only colonization. For instance, Ankit, there was no legal principles on archipelagic state, but Indonesia brought the principle of archipelagic state into the law of the sea. If Professor Khalileh mentioned before, the issue of piracy, for instance, actually it's almost the same with the UNCLOS today, since the time in the Mediterranean. So it means that there are a number of collections of ideas, coming into this current law of the sea. Professor Halileh, there's a question from a very good friend of mine, Dr. Zaki Umam. Dr. Zaki Umam, he used to live here in Berlin, and now he's back in Indonesia. He has two questions. Okay, question number one is, what extent conflict took place in the Indian Ocean between Muslims and non-Muslims, let's say Hindus and Chinese subjects, were solved in the pre-modern period? Do they use the Islamic law? Okay, and the second question, was there any Ottoman reaction to Grotius Mare Liberum? Considering that Ottoman Empire played an important role in the Mediterranean Sea from the 16th century, and also attempted to reach the Indian Ocean. So I think there are two questions here. The key issue number one is whether the Islamic approach or rules, as you mentioned, at sea, has also been used in the conflict between Muslim and Muslims in the Indian Ocean. And the second one is the Ottoman Empire reactions to Mari Libero. Please, Professor.
Yes, as regards to the first question on the conflicts, Oscar, intercommunal conflicts, I would call it. I asked myself, what was the role of the central government in the freedom of navigation? And its role was almost zero. The government that didn't play, the central government, the CAFE, didn't play an essential role in spreading the principles of the law of the sea. The law of the sea in the Indian Ocean was called customary law of the sea in the Indian Ocean, was laid by the merchants. Now, if it was laid by the merchants, then the conflicts were solved by two, either what's called lex mercatoria, the customary practice, the customs of the merchants. This is the first element. And in case that the custom, if there is no response or no answer in the merchant's customs, or merchant law, then they refer to the Quran, to refer to Islamic jurisprudence. And this is what explains why the Arabic language prevailed in the Indian Ocean. The Arabic language was basically the lingua franca of the Indian Ocean, and all agreements concluded between merchants of the same nation were written in Arabic. So the issues were solved by the representative of merchants or by the Qadi, honorman in India, or the Qadi in whatever port city, regardless of the merchant's religious affiliation. So simply everything was conducted and concluded privately. Okay? The involvement of the state almost zero. I mean, the state, the government, the central government never got engaged in the commercial transactions between merchants. I would also add here that the Qadi was appointed by the merchants themselves. They selected the most educated fair person to function as a Qadi, and the Qadi himself was also a merchant. This is in the Indian Ocean.
So it's like an arbitration today. Yeah?
Yes, there were arbitrations there. Yes, there were, and I have the earliest evidence about commercial arbitrations is documented from Guangzhou in China from the late 9th century. And the Qadi who was in China, in particular in China, the Qadi was brought from Basra and confirmed by the local authorities, accepted by or approved by the local Muslim merchant community. Now, as regards to the Ottoman response to Hugo Grotius, by the time Hugo Grotius published his book, the eastern part, even parts of the western part of the Indian Ocean, was controlled by European powers. I couldn't find anything about the Ottoman response to Grotius theory, unfortunately, because my book stops or holds at 1517, and I only touched between the famous battle between the Ottoman Mamluks and the Portuguese in India. That's it. But I couldn't find. I looked a little bit at the Ottoman sources. At least what I have found was helpless to my research. I mean, Professor Padani, from Italy, dealt with the territorial sea in Ottoman in Ottoman archives, but myself, I never touch on it.
Thank you, Prof. We have another question from Mohammed Ayub Kadir. He is appreciating your work, Professor, and he was wondering on how you define international Islamic customary law in comparison to current concept in the public international law that is based from the West. Thank you, Professor.
When I talk about international law, we don't talk about conventions. We talk about treaties between Islamic entities and non-Islamic entities or foreign entities. These treaties are not found in the Indian Ocean, but found in the Mediterranean. So, in some of these treaties were bilateral, and others were trilateral. That's to say, two Christian entities with one Islamic entity, or against Islamic entity. So this is what I call international treaties, but not we don't do international law. We don't have international law in this. We don't apply the term and the modern international law to the medieval period, because that time we don't have conventions simply, but we have treaties. So we rely on treaties in particular. Yes.
Okay, Prof. Is there anybody wants to have a direct questions and unmute themselves and unmute your video or add to the chat? So if not, I have one more question for you, Professor.
Yes.
You brought a very interesting findings about the Qadi from Basra who is posted in Guangzhou. This is very interesting for me to see that apparently the arbitration systems or the dispute settlement mechanisms within the merchants have been there since ages, in so long time ago. Now, was there a strings of Qadi from the Middle East in the whole Indian Ocean, Asia, all the way to China, where you have the trade route based on your research? And do they have the same thing going to the other direction in Africa? If you can educate me, Prof.
In Africa, well, when Muslims expanded in Indian Ocean, the Islam expanded in the Indian Ocean by merchants. Islam was carried by sea to the rest of the Indian Ocean. The first school, I would say, the Shafi'i school of law began in Palestine, moved to Egypt, from Egypt to Yemen, and the merchants of Yemen carried their doctrine to the rest of the Indian Ocean, where by the 10th century, simply the Yemenis merchants captured the place of the Omanis in the Indian Ocean. When the Omani merchants found themselves that they are playing with harder merchants, they moved to East Africa. So the spread of the Ibadah school, the spread of Islam in East Africa was through the Ibadi school of law, not Shafi'i school of law. The Shafi'i school of law, if you look carefully at the Indian Ocean, you find it along the coast of India, not in the hinterland of India, along the coast of India or Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. As regards to East Africa, I couldn't find any equivalent to the honorman or the Qadi, honorman in India, or the Qadi, the Shafi'i, the Qadi of Basra in Guangzhou in East Africa. I couldn't find, but we have archaeological evidence that the first thing to be built in the new territories was the mosque, the masjid. And I believe that the Imam of the masjid, who certainly was Omani or a person acquainted with the local and with the Arabic and local language, functioned as a Qadi. Or I assume, based on documentary evidence, that not necessarily the Imam of the masjid was functioned as a Qadi. It could have been that a representative of merchants could also function as a Qadi, as an arbitrator, not Qadi, as an arbitrator between merchants. But did I find on Omani Qadis in Eastern Africa? My answer, no, I couldn't find. Probably because I couldn't do my job pretty well. Okay, you can't cover the whole thing, in one dense book.
I understand, Prof. So we have still 15 minutes. So before we close, can you? I know you also write another book. It's the Islamic Maritime Law. Yeah, Islamic Maritime Law of the Sea. What is a major difference with your book on Islamic?
When I wrote the first book, honestly, okay, I majored in history, and I did my PhD in Princeton and in Near Eastern Studies. Then in 2005, as I said, I did my master's degree in law. Then in 2011, in 2014, I completed my JSD degree in law. When I got to Tulane, I learned to distinguish between maritime law and law of the sea. These are two different fields of law. Maritime law is commercial law, and law of the sea is, I would say, maritime law is the relationship between a person and a person at sea. However, law of the sea is the relationship between the mankind and the nature. The mankind and the nature. Definitely, and when we have the mankind and we have this, how the mankind views the nature, how the people view the sea, how they see the sea. Okay, when dealing with maritime law, the issues regarding the issues pertaining to maritime law are very clear. They deal with salvage, with jettison, general average, status of employees, and at sea, and so on, and collision and so on. When we deal with law of the sea, we deal with how the high seas are viewed, how the high seas, the territorial sea, are viewed by mankind. So it's the relationship between the mankind and the nature. This is the law of the sea. Now, how the nations, how the superpowers view the sea nowadays is a different story. But I looked from theological and jurisprudential and customer practices. I don't touch on the middle law of the sea. I do refer from time to time to the UNCLOS, but the UNCLOS is different from the way classical Islamic cultures view the sea, or the way the Quran views sea. There are some overlaps, but nowadays, and as you have presented in your last presentation, superpowers are changing the status of the sea. They view the sea as something belong to them, okay, but not necessarily, but not in definitely in Islamic terms.
Okay, Prof. So indeed, it's very exciting, and from the questions also you see a very excited colleague from Indonesia. The last question was actually come from Muhammad Kadir from University of Shakwala, Aceh. And we have seen the different colleagues from different professions, and I think we learned a lot today. And I would like once again to extend to you, Professor, our deepest gratitude, our thanks to you that you are even willing to talk with us on the basis just an email. And that's I find it very, very incredible and very heartwarming. And I hope that we can touch base in the future. And
Inshallah.
if you ever come to Germany, inshallah, we shall see. I can come to Heidelberg to see you and your son. So once
Inshallah.
again, Professor, on behalf of my team here in Berlin, and I think also from my colleagues in Indonesia, we would like to extend to you once again our thanks to you. And a message for our colleague in Indonesia, if you want to invite Professor Khalili to speak in your university maybe at some point, you can email me and then I will arrange that your request to Professor Khalili. So I hope that this is the first step to further connections between Professor Khalili and Indonesia in the Indonesian academic world. We are the largest archipelagic state in the world, Prof. We are very passionate with our sea, and your subject, it really touches us as well. So once again, Professor, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Salam.
Thank you very much.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Stay healthy, Prof.